This is Radio Health Journal. I'm Reed Pence. This week, how traumatic brain injuries can impact relationships.
Like many people, brain injury is pretty frustrating, so he experiences some more frustration and irritability and anger than he did in the past.
Surviving one of the worst strains a marriage can take, when Radio Health Journal returns.
I'm Nancy Benson, host of Radio Health Journal. If you enjoy listening to Radio Health Journal, you'll also like our sister show, Viewpoints, which covers a wide array of topics from education to history to the environment. Here's a preview of what they're covering this week on Viewpoints.
The Salvation Army has definitely seen that drop off. A lot of people approach the kettle and say, I don't have any cash with me.
The digital currency effect on low-income populations. Then,
how many people focus on getting the holiday cards done, making the cookies, buying the right gift? We have historically done this as a culture and society, and I think we've been off base from the get-go.
Focusing on what really matters this holiday season. I'm Marty Peterson.
And I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth this week on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.
Listen to Viewpoints on your favorite radio station and subscribe and listen to shows anytime on Apple Podcasts and Google Play.
When we're driving, swimming, riding a bike, or out on the job, we never really stop to think that something awful might be around the next bend. When a terrible accident occurs, it can have an impact on every aspect of a survivor's life. For Megan Horst's husband, Christian, it was a bike accident that caused a life-altering brain injury.
So in February 2012, my husband flipped over the handlebars of his bicycle due to a mechanical failure on his bike, and he hit his head and sustained a traumatic brain injury. He was in the hospital at Harborview for about 10 weeks and in a coma for the first few weeks of that, and then sort of emerging from the coma and adapting to new life after that.
New life after a traumatic brain injury can mean a lot of things. Some bad injuries you may not even see. Many car accidents jostle the brain and affect cognitive abilities, personality, and temperament. Lori Weissman is a psychotherapist, consultant, and educator specializing in traumatic brain injury.
The frontal lobe is injured. Many people that are in car accidents are hit from behind, and the brain is pushed forward and it slams up against the skull, and then it produces what we call a contre-coup injury. The brain goes forward and back, often side to side, and if the impact is strong enough, it will also cause some shearing in the fibers in the brain, and these kinds of injuries will cause changes and damage to certain areas of the brain that are responsible for these functions.
A big issue for men and women, surprisingly, is anger. People are easily angered, and they're often described as irritable. Many people describe personality changes, depression, social withdrawal.
That's Dr. Jeffrey Scott Kreutzer, professor of physical medicine and rehabilitation at Virginia Commonwealth University. He says these changes can have a big impact on those closest to survivors, most notably spouses. Horst agrees that suddenly a husband like Christian isn't quite the same.
My husband didn't have maybe as severe of personality changes as I see in other folks. His core personality remains very similar and his interests are, but he has changed in many ways, and some of those simply complicated by the fact that his brain doesn't function in the same way he used to. So he communicates differently, I'd say more slowly. He has challenge with executive functioning. Some of his short-term memory and long-term memory are damaged or have challenges. So just being able to engage in reminiscing or in talking through what we did today, like many people with brain injury is pretty frustrating. So he experiences some more frustration and irritability and anger than he did in the past.
This alters everything in a marriage. For example, the brain injury survivor has new challenges that keep them from doing things they used to do.
The person with the injury, their capabilities are affected. So, for example, a common situation is where a man is injured in a motor vehicle accident or at work, and he can no longer work. So that person's role is now not a breadwinner when, in fact, they used to pride themselves on working 40 to 60 hours a week.
That means a shift in roles emerges in a marriage. Someone who was once a capable breadwinner now has to relearn basic skills. Megan and Christian's day-to-day relationship has been very different since the accident.
In the short term, kind of in the year maybe right after his brain injury, one of the biggest changes was that I was one of his primary caretakers. And during that time, I really was doing a lot of caretaking, especially when he first came home from the hospital. I was preparing his food and managing his schedule and taking him everywhere he needed to go because he really wasn't capable at that time of going anywhere on his own without getting lost. And kind of also managing our household financials. I was the sole income earner minus some support we were getting from his labor and industry case. So, I think basically I took over the vast majority of both our household operations and also just my main role was helping him function. So it didn't really feel like a romantic partnership at all. It felt much more like a caretaking partnership.
This change in roles is typical in marriages after a brain injury. But as Kreutzer says, that's far from all. Often, traumatic brain injury changes someone's temperament, personality, and abilities so much that they seem like a completely different person, a stranger.
The person with the brain injury will say most often, I feel like I'm living with someone else's brain. I don't know this brain that I am living with. I'm not familiar with how I'm thinking, how I'm behaving. And the spouse will also say, I feel like I'm living with a stranger. I don't know who this person is.
Both spouses have to navigate new life after brain injury. Megan views her life and marriage in two parts, one with her old husband and the other with someone who felt like a stranger.
The brain injury both happens to the individual who receives it, but definitely also to the people that spend a lot of time with that person. So certainly I feel like my life, I will always think of it now as pre and post his brain injury.
By now, Megan says Christian feels less like a stranger, but he's definitely a different person from the man she married.
Now I do think I really do know the new Christian, that's his name, that new husband. I definitely know a lot about who he is now as a person, both his challenges, but also his really positive sides that have emerged post-brain injury that are both the same and some that are different from before. So I guess it's not so much that he feels like a stranger anymore to me or surprised. It's more just that it still is kind of a grapple of missing the old one and then coming to terms with, but this is who he is now. It's a sort of constant work of not just acceptance, although at its base acceptance, both acceptance and trying to enjoy the new one.
Megan says she misses her old husband. That's common for those close to traumatic brain injury survivors. The concept is called ambiguous grief or loss and occurs when proper closure, like a funeral to mark the end of a life, doesn't happen.
There is a grieving process. Basically, that grieving process is maybe having a wake, having a funeral. There's a closure. There's a sense of life being different and being much more difficult. But the person is dead, and there's a marking by funerals of that person's death. Where with ambiguous loss, there is no such marking. There is no such event that can celebrate the person's life. The person continues to live with ambiguous loss, but is living with a very different personality.
In my case, with brain injury, the person is still alive, looks very similar, and is still my husband in name, has that same history, but he's a very different person. I indeed have lost my first husband.
Weissman says this kind of loss can take a huge toll on spouses like Megan. She describes feelings of depression, stress, anxiety, and fear, all typical emotions for someone dealing with ambiguous grief. It's important that spouses take care of themselves.
I always say that the brain injury happens to the spouse also, and the spouse is often neglected in this whole process because all of the attention is focused on the person who has had the injury.
Adjusting to life with a stranger is incredibly frustrating and lonely for spouses. Family and friends often provide support early on, but they don't understand the depths of traumatic brain injury and recovery.
Mild traumatic brain injury is often referred to as a silent epidemic, which means that no one would ever know that this person is struggling because they look the same. And people that have experienced a traumatic brain injury often describe their experience as being in an invisible wheelchair. And this is the primary reason why, as time goes on, support from friends and family fall off.
I think maybe only he and I and maybe his sister and a couple other people we're really close with really fully understand the broad range of all the impacts it has. I think most other people see him every few months and they're like, he's doing great. And he is. But there's also a lot of challenges that they're just not seeing in that short interaction.
Friends and relatives who aren't quite as close have a hard time understanding the changes to personality and temperament caused by brain damage. Megan says some people simply don't have the patience to understand Christian's challenges. But what happens when spouses like Megan find the challenges and changes in their relationship too difficult to handle? Has Megan ever thought of leaving?
I think there's a lot of pressure put on people, spouses with brain injury, to stay with them, to support them. And in all reality, many people with brain injury, my husband included, don't have a whole lot of other options. I'm his primary financial support in addition to emotional support. So with that larger context in mind, yes, there have definitely been moments where I've thought, it would just be easier to start over, to sort of wash my hands of this, if you will, to take a break from it, I've sort of imagined or thought about lots of different scenarios. And at the end of the day, 7.5 years later, we are still together. We're living together. It has lots of challenges, and I'm not 100% sure what our future holds. But I remain committed to helping him, and also to helping him as a partner and as a family member and as a friend and as someone who loves him.
Traumatic brain injury causes so much uncertainty. For survivors, Kreutzer says therapy can be a great space to learn strategies to deal with their new emotions, as well as to be reminded of their self-worth.
Part of what I do in my therapeutic process when I'm working with an individual versus a couple is I help that individual see that they have changed, that they're a different person, usually a person they don't like as much. I've had people in tears say to me, I know I'm a different person. I don't like the way I am. I would do anything to be the person I used to be. So part of what the therapeutic process is to help normalize the situation, help the person recognize that they're focused on these negative qualities, that the injury in most cases was no fault of their own, and that with patience and persistence over time, they can be a more likable person.
Weissman says therapy can also be a resource for spouses to deal with the changes in their relationship.
I do a lot of normalizing with the spouse, that it's normal for the spouse to feel angry and sad and frustrated and scared, while they are also being able to create a new vision with their spouse.
However, that can take a long time. After 7.5 years, Megan and Christian are still figuring out what their vision for the future is.
There are lots of days and moments he really still sees himself capable of doing the kind of work he used to do and pursuing his passions and his career dreams and financial dreams that he had for himself. And then yet I sort of live in the reality where I see his challenges, and I just don't think that future is possible for him. I think different futures are possible, but I think he still finds that really upsetting.
Traumatic brain injuries can turn a husband into a stranger. They change the survivor's life and relationships, but they don't end them. You can find out more information about this topic and all of our guests on our website, radiohealthjournal.org. I'm Reed Pence.
With many opportunities to celebrate during fall and winter, preparing foods for all the festive occasions can be both a joy and a challenge. Selecting basic foods that can work in multiple ways, such as fresh grapes, can simplify things greatly. According to registered dietitian Courtney Romano, health advisor to the California Table Grape Commission.
Fresh grapes are beautiful. They taste great and are easy to keep around for everyday eating as well as special occasions. Keep some on hand for a healthy snack option. Arrange them in a pretty bowl for a classic and edible centerpiece, or in small clusters on a serving platter. Use them as a special ingredient. Heart-healthy grapes can be dipped in dark chocolate for a delightful dessert that is good for you too.
Heart-healthy grapes from California are in season from May through January. Grapes of all colors, red, green, and black, are a natural source of beneficial antioxidants and other polyphenols, which may help contribute to heart health. Visit grapesfromcalifornia.com for more information.
December 5 through 11 is National Influenza Vaccination Week. The American College of Physicians, a national organization of internists, advises adults to get an annual influenza vaccine. It's also the perfect time for adults to discuss with their internist other recommended vaccinations they might need. Dr. George M. Abraham is ACP's president.
As we continue to deal with the impact of COVID, we must not ignore the need for protection from influenza. Vaccinations protect us against more serious health issues that result in hospitalization, disability, or even death. They also help prevent the spread of disease, especially among those who are vulnerable to complications, such as the elderly and others with chronic conditions or weakened immune systems.
In addition to getting an annual influenza vaccine, ACP advises adults to ask their internist if they need vaccinations or boosters to protect against other preventable diseases like tetanus, diphtheria, whooping cough, pneumococcal pneumonia, meningitis, cervical and other cancers, hepatitis B, and shingles. Find out more at acponline.org/AI.
And that's Radio Health Journal for this week. Radio Health Journal is a production of MediaTrax Communications. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more. And check Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify for a library of past programs. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and information about our guests at radiohealthjournal.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Radio Health Journal.
Coming up next week on Radio Health Journal.
In fact, you are increasing levels of beta amyloid that is a hallmark of Alzheimer's disease, even after one night of sleep deprivation.
How not getting enough sleep is way worse for the body and mind than we ever suspected.
Then the race for a COVID-19 vaccine and why most of the big vaccine makers struck out.
Some of them had efforts that faltered. Some of them sort of were interested in building a COVID-19 vaccine, but really weren't.
All that and more on Radio Health Journal.